Hello, my name is Karoline Osnes and I work as a postdoc at the research group SIMLab and at the research center CASA at NTNU in Norway. And this study here was presented at the conference DYMAT on the 22nd of September. And the study addresses modeling of laminated glass exposed to ballistic impact. And the project has been a collaboration between SIMLab and the Norwegian Defence Estates Agency and with support from NTNU. The objective of this study has been divided into two parts, an experimental part and a numerical part. And in the experimental part or study, we wish to investigate laminated glass under ballistic loading. And the focus here was to determine the ballistic limit velocity and the ballistic limit curves. And we also used these experiments to obtain a basis of comparison with numerical results. In the numerical study, we wanted to investigate the accuracy of relatively simple finite element models. And we wanted to study how well these models would recreate the ballistic tests. And in these simulations, we used node splitting. The specimens that we tested were double laminated glass plates, and they consisted of 3 glass layers and 2 PVB layers. And PVB is a polymer, and it's the most common polymer used in laminated glass. The thickness of the glass layers were 3.8 millimeters and the PVB layers 1.52 millimeters. And this resulted in a laminate with a thickness of approximately 14.4 millimeters. And the in-plane dimensions were 400 times 400 millimeters. PVB is a very flexible polymer. It's almost incompressible and it's very temperature and strain rate dependent. The glass that we used is called soda lime silica float glass, and it's the most common glass material used for windows. It's very brittle and has a linear elastic behavior until fracture, and it's also isotropic. In addition, the fracture strength of glass has usually a large variation, but we have seen that this variation is not very large under ballistic loading. We tested 2 different configurations, one with a single laminated glass plate, and in the other we used 2 laminated glass plates with 24 millimeter spacing. In the setup, we clamped the specimens between thick steel plates, and to not damage the glass before testing, we placed 4 millimeter rubber strips between the steel and the glass. The bullet that we used was a 7.52 millimeter armor-piercing bullet, and it typically has a mass of 10.5 grams. And it consists of a hard steel core, a lead cap, and a brass jacket and an end cap. And the striking point of the bullet was at the center of the plate and also perpendicular to the plate. In the single plate setup, we call it DL1, we performed 2 tests, and we used impact velocities of 394 and 519 meters per second. In the double plate setup, DL2, we did 6 tests with impact velocities between 376 and 698 meters per second. And now I will present the experimental results, and we started by fitting the Recte-Ibsen model to our test results. And this model describes the relationship between the impact and the residual velocity of the bullet. So it describes the ballistic limit curve. And in this model, we have 2 fitting parameters, A and P, and these control the shape of the ballistic limit curve. And we assume that these parameters would be the same for both of the setups, so both DL1 and DL2, and we calculated them as 1 and 1.5. And the ballistic limit velocities were found to be 232 meters per second for DL1 and 395 meters per second for DL2. And this figure here shows the ballistic limit curves for the 2 setups. And also I've included the results for the different tests. So DL1 is shown by a blue color and DL2 by orange. And we see that the Recte-Ipsen model describes the relationship between the impact and the residual velocity pretty well. And from this plot, we see that there are two DL2 tests where the residual velocity was 0. So the bullet was stopped in the second or the rearmost plate. So here I have included videos from two of the experiments, one DL1 test and one DL2. In the DL1 test, we used an impact velocity of 520 meters per second, and we obtained a residual velocity of 413. And in the other test, the impact velocity is almost the same as in the DL1 test, and the residual velocity ended up being 241. And since the impact velocity is almost the same in these two tests, we can assume that the velocity between the plates in the DL2 test is approximately the same as the residual velocity in the DL1 test, probably slightly higher since the impact velocity is a bit higher in the DL2 test. So in these experiments, we observed a lot of different mechanisms. First, we got very fine powder-like glass fragments at the contact points. Then, shortly after, about 20 to 40 microseconds, the glass shattered at the backside of the glass plate. Next, we got clouds of glass fragments on both sides of the plate, and we also saw that these clouds traveled in opposite directions. Also, we saw that the lead cap and the brass parts were always peeled off the bullet during impact. But we didn't really see that much damage in the core of the bullet, only small changes to the tip of the core. Another observation in the tests was that the second plate in the DL2 test was hit by fragments from the first plate. But we assumed that these fragments had a limited loading effect on the second plate compared to the bullet, since the fragments were so dispersed. Then over to the numerical study, and here we performed finite element simulations of all of the ballistic tests, and we used the finite element code impetus AFEA solver. And this solver has some special features, such as higher order elements and node splitting. And node splitting can describe fracture and crack propagation by separating elements instead of deleting them as we do with element erosion. So we are able to describe fragmentation without losing any mass. And higher order elements can provide extra robustness and accuracy, and it's particularly suitable for simulations that involves large deformations. For the laminated glass, we use 4 × 4 mm elements, and we also refined the mesh around the impact points. And this mesh refinement was divided into 3 different zones. And the inner zone was refined the most, and we also used third order elements. To model the glass, we used a linear elastic material model with a brittle failure criterion in tension, and we also used node splitting to describe fracture. To model the PVB, we also used a linear elastic model and then a critical failure strain criterion. And the stiffness of the PVB was chosen as the instantaneous modulus, and since we get very large strain rates during ballistic impact tests, the PVB will get a relatively stiff behavior, so we found this modulus to be suitable. But these material and failure models are quite simplified, and they will not be able to capture local effects that happens in the laminated glass during loading, so for example crushing of the glass material. But the main goal of this numerical study was to recreate the global behavior, such as the bullet velocity. And since the laminated glass plates were relatively thin, it was likely that the tensile failure in the glass would dominate the behavior, and we also assumed that the local effects would not contribute that much to this global behavior. And I can also mention that we performed a parametric study of the different material parameters to have more control and to study the sensitivity of the model. The description of the bullet was more accurate, and here we used a rigid model for the core, and the brass and the lead material was described by the Johnson-Cook material model and the Cockcroft-Latham failure criterion. Okay, so now I will present the numerical results, and we start with videos of a DL1 test and a DL2 test. And here are videos of the corresponding simulations. And we see that the path of the bullet is recreated pretty well in both of the simulations. And we see that the residual velocity has an error of only 1 and 2%. Also, we see that the brass and the lead parts of the bullet is pulled off the core, just as we saw in the experiments. Of course, we see that the fracture and pulverization of the glass are not entirely captured, but this is mostly due to the mesh being too coarse and also maybe because of the simplified models. But the global behavior seems to be represented pretty well, which was the ultimate goal of these simulations. So here I have some more details from the DL2 simulation, and I have included the entire velocity history of the bullets in this figure, and this is shown by a red line. And the green dashed lines refers to the test data. And as I mentioned earlier, we could assume that the velocity between the two plates would be approximately 430, slightly higher than that, and this is also captured very well by the simulation. This figure here shows the relationship between the impact and the residual velocity for all of the experiments and the simulations. And we see that the simulations correspond extremely well with the two DL1 tests, and we also included a simulation where the impact velocity was equal to the ballistic limit velocity, and this resulted in embedment in the numerical simulation. So the results were really good. For the DL2 test, the simulations differs a bit more from the tests, and generally we got a higher impact resistance in the simulations compared to the experiments, but the agreement is still pretty good. And one thing that might explain this disagreement for DL2 is the failure description of the bullet, because in the simulations, damage in the bullet was done by element erosion, so failed bullet elements would be removed and it wouldn't contribute to damage of the glass as it would in the experiments. So if we used node splitting for the bullet instead, we would probably get closer to the experimental results. Alright, so that was the end of this presentation. Now I will go quickly through a summary and concluding remarks. So we studied double laminated glass plates under ballistic impact by both experiments and finite element simulations. And in the finite element simulations, we used node splitting. We tested two different configurations, a single plate and a double plate configuration. And we used simplified material and fracture models for the glass and the PVB, but we still saw that the simulations recreated the global behavior of the experiments very well. And finally, this study shows that the numerical techniques that we used have a great potential for use in ballistic impact simulations.